Hi, everybody. This is Denise Tawwab. I'm coming back to you this morning to talk about NIST Special Publication 839, covering step 3 in the risk management process. We're talking about risk response. We're going to cover an overview of how the NIST Special Publications um, lay out the process for taking this step. We'll talk about what risk response is, inputs and preconditions, risk response activities, and outputs and post conditions from the risk response step. First up, overview of the process. Each of the steps in the risk management process is described in a structured manner in all NIST special publications, focusing on inputs and preconditions necessary to begin the step, specific tasks that you complete to finish the step, outputs and post conditions that result from the steps, and the effects of the risk concepts described in Chapter 2 are also discussed in the context of the risk management process and its approach. So here's what we're looking at when we're talking about the risk management process. We're talking about framing risk, which we cover in another video, assessing risk, responding to risk, and also monitoring risk. And so there are 4 separate videos that make up the process steps. And then I have a risk management, a NIST 839 foundation of the risk management process video for those of you who are interested in looking at the full picture. Okay, about risk response. What is risk response? Risk response is step 3 of the risk management process outlined in this special publication 839. Risk response identifies, evaluates, decides on, and implements appropriate courses of action to avoid, to mitigate, to share, or to transfer risk to your business resulting from the operation and the use of information systems. Let me say that again. Risk response identifies, evaluates, decides on, and implements appropriate courses of action to accept, avoid, mitigate, share, or transfer risk to your organization resulting from the operation and use of information systems. There are 6 possible responses accept, avoid, mitigate, share, transfer, or a combination of the above. So, what happens on each risk management tier? Identifying and analyzing alternative courses of action typically occur at tiers 1 or 2. This is due to the fact that alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of organization wide impacts and the ability of the business to continue to successfully carry out its business functions. Decisions to employ risk response measures organization wide are typically made at tier 1, although the decisions are informed by risk related information from tiers 2 and 3. At tier 2, the business tier, alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of the anticipated impacts on the mission business functions and the resources required. At tier 3, which is at the system level, alternative courses of action tend to be evaluated in terms of the system development lifecycle or the maximum amount of time available for implementing the selected courses of actions. And you'll hear these courses of actions called controls. So we're going to put controls in place to manage the risk. The breadth of potential risk response is a major factor for whether the activity is carried out at tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Risk response decisions are influenced by organizational risk tolerance developed as part of your risk framing activities that happen at tier 1, the organization tier. Your organization can implement risk decisions at any of the risk management tiers with different objectives and utility of information that's produced. Alternative courses of action or potential risk responses are evaluated again in terms of the anticipated organization wide impacts and whether they affect the organization's ability to continue to operate successfully. Decisions to employ risk response measures organization wide, again, are typically made at Tier 1, although these decisions are informed by risk related information from the lower tiers. At Tier 2, the mission business level, alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of anticipated impacts on the mission business functions, associated business processes supporting the mission business functions, and the resource requirements. What do we have to do? How is implementing these controls going to impact what we're doing? And what are the resources in terms of people, money, and what have you, do we need to commit to be able to implement this risk response? At Tier 3, the system level, alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of the SDLC or the maximum amount of time available for implementing the course of action. The breadth of the potential risk response is a major factor for whether the activity is carried out at Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. NIST Special Publication 837, um, Guide for Applying the Risk Management Framework to Federal Information Systems, is written for Tier 3 risk management activities. So 837 gets into the weeds on how to handle things, and I do a whole um, presentation on that. Next up, inputs and preconditions to the risk response step. All right, inputs and preconditions for risk response that come from step 1, the risk framing step, include a risk response guidance from the risk management strategy, general organization guidance on appropriate responses to risk, and the risk framing step directly shapes the resource constraints that are associated with selecting an appropriate course of action. Because remember, this is at the layer, senior management, and they're making budgetary decisions and allocating resources. And so a lot of your constraints are going to come from Tier 1. All right, inputs and preconditions from step 2, the risk assessment step. Threat sources and threat events, vulnerabilities, estimates of potential impact if threats exploit vulnerabilities, like how bad is it going to be if something bad happens, the estimates that something is likely to happen, and a determination of risk to the organization. All of this stuff comes out of the risk assessment step, which is step 2 of the risk management process. Okay, other inputs for the risk response step include um, input from the risk monitoring step. And we haven't talked about that yet. That's the 4th step in the risk management process. But when there is a breach or compromise to your information systems or your environments of operation that require some kind of response to address the incident and reduce additional risk, um, there's information that comes out of that that's fed back into the risk response. The risk response step can receive input from the risk framing step. When organizations are required to deploy new safeguards and countermeasures in their information systems, for instance, based on new security requirements, new legislation, or OMB, if you're a federal agency, OMB policies. So something can happen in the environment that causes you to have to rethink your risk response. So you're getting input into the risk response step from every other step in the risk management process. Additional preconditions from the risk framing step, constraints that are based on architecture and previous investments. If you're running legacy systems, some of the controls won't work and you'll have to do compensating controls. Organizational preferences and tolerances. Is your organization let's get the latest and greatest technology, or are they taking a more conservative approach? That will impact the risk responses that you choose. The expected effectiveness at mitigating risk, including how effectiveness is measured and monitored, and the time horizon for the risk. A risk that is expected to occur in the future based on the results of threat assessments or plan changes in your business functions, your enterprise architecture, or some aspects of legal or regulatory compliance. A lot of people began to put things in place, for instance, in 2018, actually, before then, ahead of the GDPR privacy regulations. And so it's that kind of thing that we're talking about when you know something is coming down the pipe, or you're planning some changes in your enterprise architecture. Sorry about hitting the mic. Um, those are things from the risk framing step that will inform how you choose and implement your risk responses. All right, let's talk about the four specific activities that are outlined in 839 as part of the risk response step. The four activities include risk response identification, evaluation of alternatives, risk response decision, and risk response implementation. Okay, task 3.1, risk response identification. Task 3.1 is identify alternative courses of action to respond to risks determined during the risk assessment. So you've had your risk assessment, you've determined some risks that you want to deal with. Task 3.1, you identify the different ways that you could respond to that particular risk. A course of action is a time phased or situation dependent combination of risk response measures. So let's talk about an example. In an emergency situation, you might accept the risk associated with connection to an external communications provider for a limited amount of time, then avoid the risk by cutting the connection, mitigate risk in the near term by applying security controls to search for malware or evidence of unauthorized access to information that occurred during the period of unfiltered connection. And finally, you might mitigate risk long term by applying controls to handle such connections more securely in the future. Again, this slide talks about the six possible responses to risk. Let's review that. You can accept a risk, avoid it, mitigate it, share it, or transfer it, or you can do some combination of the above. Acceptance is the appropriate risk response when the identified risk is within your organization's risk tolerance. We're just going to accept that risk. Organizations can accept risk deemed to be low, moderate, or high, depending on the particular situation or conditions. You may accept substantially greater risk in the moderate to high range because of compelling mission, business, or operational needs. Organizations typically make determinations about the general level and types of acceptable risk, considering organizational priorities and trade offs between near term mission business needs and potential for longer term mission business impacts, and your organization's interests and the potential impacts on individuals, other organizations such as your business partners, maybe your vendors, and the nation. So let's look at an example of risk accept. I'm sorry. Let's look at an example of risk acceptance. Organizations with data centers that reside in the northeastern part of the United States may opt to have earthquakes based on the known likelihood of earthquakes and data center vulnerability to damage by earthquakes. Organizations accept the fact that earthquakes are possible, but given the infrequency of major earthquakes in that region of the United States, will believe that it's not cost effective to address that particular risk. That is, the organizations determine that risk associated with earthquakes is low. Another example is that your organization may accept substantially greater risk in the moderate high range because of a compelling business or operational need. Federal agencies may decide to share very sensitive information with first responders who don't typically have access to such information due to the time sensitive needs, for example, to stop pending terrorist attacks, even though the information is not itself perishable with regard to risk through the loss of confidentiality. Okay, that last line came straight from 839. Let me say that again because that sounded confusing when I said it. Federal agencies may decide to share very sensitive information with first responders who don't typically have access to such information time-sensitive needs to stop pending terrorist attacks, even though the information is not itself perishable with regard to risk through loss of confidentiality. So we're sharing information that we would normally keep confidential with first responders because we've got a pending terrorist attack. The information, of course, isn't going to be destroyed as it might be in an earthquake or some sort of more physical disaster, but we're risking the loss of confidentiality by sharing it with parties who would not normally have access to that information. Next up is risk avoidance. Risk avoidance may be the appropriate risk response when the identified risk exceeds the organization's risk tolerance. Your business may conduct certain types of activities or employ certain types of IT products that result in risk that is unacceptable. For many people, cloud technology was that for a very long time. In such situations, risk avoidance involves taking specific actions to eliminate the activities or the technologies that are the basis for the risk, or to revise or reposition these activities or technologies in the organization's business processes to avoid the potential for unacceptable risk. And as it relates to cloud, you have a lot of businesses that have hybrid cloud situations where they have some of their information in the cloud, but the more sensitive data is kept on premise. So, example one of risk avoidance. Organizations planning to employ network connections between two domains may determine through risk assessments that there is unacceptable risk in establishing such connections. The business may also determine that implementing effective safeguards and countermeasures across domain solution is not practical in the given circumstance. Thus, the organizations decide to avoid the risk by eliminating the electronic or and employing an air gap with a manual connection process. For example, data transfers by secondary storage devices. Risk mitigation is the next risk response that we'll talk about. Risk mitigation, or also known as risk reduction, is the appropriate risk response for that portion of risk that cannot be accepted, avoided, shared, or transferred. The alternatives to mitigate risk depend on the risk management tier and the scope of risk tolerance of risk response decisions assigned or delegated to organizational officials at that tier. So this comes out of your governance. The risk management strategy and associated risk response strategies also affect how risk is mitigated. The means used by organizations to mitigate risk can involve a combination of risk response measures across all three of the tiers. So let's talk about risk mitigation examples. Example one, risk mitigation can include common security controls at tier one, process re-engineering at tier two, which is the business layer, and or new or enhanced management, operational, or technical safeguards um, at tier three, or some combination. Example two of risk mitigation. When adversaries gain access to mobile devices, that's your laptops, computers, tablets, while users are traveling, possible risk mitigation measures include policies that prohibit transport of mobile devices to certain areas of the world, or procedures for users to obtain a clean mobile device that is never allowed to connect to the network. Next, we'll talk about risk sharing or transfer. Risk sharing or risk transfer is the appropriate risk response when your organizations desire to have the means to shift risk liability and responsibility to other organizations, using insurance to transfer risk from particular organizations to insurance companies, for example. Risk sharing shifts a portion of the risk responsibility or liability to other organizations, usually organizations that are more qualified to address the risk. Risk transfer reduces neither the likelihood of harmful events occurring nor the consequences in terms of harm to organizational operations, assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. Risk sharing may be a sharing of liability or sharing of responsibility for other adequate risk responses, such as mitigation. Therefore, the concept of risk transfer is less applicable in the public sector for your federal, state, and local governments than in the private sector, as liability of organizations is generally established by legislation or policy. So if you're a federal organization, then you're not really able to transfer risk. If you're a federal, state, or governmental organization, you're not usually able to transfer risk. As such, self initiated transfers of risk by public sector organizations, uh, as typified by purchasing insurance, are generally not possible. Risk sharing often occurs when organizations determine that addressing risk requires expertise or resources that are better provided by other organizations. And I'll give you an example. An identified risk might be the physical penetration of perimeters and kinetic attacks by terrorist groups. The organization decides to partner with another organization sharing the physical facility to take joint responsibility for addressing risk from kinetic attacks. Okay, so that's task 3-1. Task 3-2 is the evaluation of alternatives. So we've identified um, possible alternatives in task 3-1. In task 3-2, we're ready to evaluate those alternatives. So task 3-2, according to 839, is evaluate alternative courses of action for responding to risk. The evaluation of alternative courses of action can include um, the expected effectiveness in achieving desired risk response and how effectiveness is measured and monitored. Anticipated feasibility of implementation, including, for example, business impact, political, legal, social, financial, technical, and economic considerations. Economic considerations include costs throughout the expected period of time during which the course of action is followed. For example, the cost of procurement, integration into organizational processes at tier one and or tier two, information systems at tier three, training and maintenance. So when you're evaluating courses of action, you want to look at the full life cycle and understand that it's not just the cost of solution. Say if your solution is a firewall, well, it's not just how much the firewall costs. It's also how much is it going to cost to integrate that into the network, into your business processes, at tiers 1, 2, and 3, training and ongoing maintenance. So all of that has to be included, and a lot of times people don't cover the full cost evaluating alternatives. I would encourage you to remember that. Trade-offs of alternative courses of action. During the evaluation of alternative courses of action, trade offs can be made explicit between near term gains in business effectiveness or efficiency and long term risk of business harm due to compromise of information or information systems that are providing this near term benefit. An example of trade offs, organizations concerned about the potential for mobile devices, for example, laptops being compromised while employees are traveling, can evaluate several courses of action, including providing users traveling to high risk areas with clean laptops, removing hard drives from laptops and operating from CDs or DVDs, or having laptops go through a detailed assessment for being allowed to connect back to organizational networks. The first option, as returning laptops are never connected to your organizational networks. The second option ensures that hard drives can't be corrupted. However, it's still possible that hardware devices, for example, the motherboards, could be compromised. The third option's effectiveness is limited by the ability of organizations to detect potential insertion of malware into the hardware, firmware, or software. As such, it is going to be the least effective of the three options. From a cost perspective, the first option, The first option is providing clean laptops to users traveling to high-risk areas. The first option is potentially the most expensive, depending on the number of travelers, hence the number of travel laptops required. The second and third options are considerably less expensive. From a mission and operational perspective, the third option is the best alternative as users have access to standard laptop configurations, including all applications and supporting data needed to perform tasks, supporting business functions. Such applications and data would not be available if the first or second option is selected. So, if we remove the hard drives from the laptops, then there's going to be some loss of functionality. That's option two. And option three is having laptops go through a detailed assessment before being allowed to connect to the networks. Okay, some other supplemental guidance, and in the publications, there'll be areas called supplemental guidance, and a lot of the material in these presentations come from the supplemental guidance section. Budgetary constraints, consistency with investment management strategies, civil liberties, and privacy are some of the important elements that your organizations will consider when selecting appropriate courses of action. In those instances where your organizations only identify a single course of action, then the evaluation is focused on whether the course of action is adequate. In some cases, there is only going to be one risk response that's available, and you still have to discuss how to ensure that that is adequate. If the course of action is deemed inadequate, then your organization needs to refine the identified course of action to address the inadequacies or to develop another course of action. In summary, a risk versus risk response trade off is conducted for each course of action to provide the information necessary for selecting between the courses of action and evaluating the courses of action in terms of response, effectiveness, cost, business impact, and any other factors deemed relevant to the organization. Okay, limited resources. Part of risk versus risk response trade off considers the issue of competing resources. How many of us wish we had an unlimited budget? From an organizational perspective, this means that organiza- organizations consider whether the cost for implementing a given course of action has the potential to negatively impact other business functions, and if so, to what extent. And when we talk about cost, we're talking money, personnel, as well as time. This is necessary because organizations have finite resources to employ and many competing business functions across many organizational elements. Therefore, organizations assess the overall value of alternative courses of action with regard to the business functions and the potential risk to each organizational element. Organizations may determine that irrespective of a particular business function and the validity of the associated risk, there are more important mission business functions that face more significant risk and hence have a better claim on the limited resources. And this is where you're talking about the money and you're having to justify setting up the information security program that you would like. At some point, you're going to have to go to the checkbook keepers and explain why what you're doing should be prioritized on the list in such a way that other things may not get covered. So, in a very real sense, you're competing for resources. Okay, that's task 3.2. Next task is task 3.3, risk response decision. So you've identified alternative courses of action for the risk that you identified in your risk assessment. You have looked at those alternative courses of actions and evaluated them. And now you have to make a risk response decision. So task 3.3 is decide on the appropriate course of action for responding to risk. Decisions on the most appropriate course of action include some form of prioritization. Some risk may be of greater concern than other risk. In that case, more resources may need to be directed at addressing higher priority risk than at other lower priority risk. This do not does this does not necessarily mean that the lower priority risk would not be addressed. Rather, it could mean that fewer resources might be directed at the lower priority risk, at least in the beginning, or that the lower priority risk would be addressed at a later time. A key part of the risk decision process is the recognition that regardless of the decision, there still remains a degree of residual risk that must be addressed. Organizations determine acceptable degrees of residual risk based on the organization's risk tolerance and the specific risk tolerance of particular decision makers. Impacting the decision process are some of the more intangible risk related concepts, for example, risk tolerance, trust, and culture. The specific beliefs and approaches that organizations embrace with respect to these risk related concepts affect the course of action selected by decision makers. So, a lot is happening in the risk response decision. But again, it's about prioritizing based on the availability of money, time, and people against commensurate with the risk that you're facing and in keeping with the criticality of the assets that you're looking to protect. So all of that comes into play, and we discuss that more in other publications. 839 is a high level, so for now we're going to leave the risk response decision, and we're going to go to task 3.4, which is risk response implementation. Task 3.4 says implement the course of action selected to respond to risk. Once a course of action is selected, organizations implement the associated risk response. Given the size and complexity of some businesses, the actual implementation of risk response measures may be challenging. Some risk response measures are tactical in nature, for example, applying patches to identified vulnerabilities in your information systems, and can be implemented rather quickly. Other risk response measures may be more strategic in nature and reflect solutions that take longer to implement. Therefore, organizations apply and tailor as appropriate to a specific risk response course of action the risk response implementation considerations in the risk response strategies. And so now we're looking at the risk management strategy developed during the risk framing step. Okay, we've covered everything about the risk response activities, and now we're looking at the outputs and post conditions. What comes out of the risk response step? The output of the risk response step is the implementation of the selected courses of action with consideration for individuals or organizational elements responsible for the selected risk response measures and specifications of effectiveness criteria, articulation of indicators and thresholds against which the effectiveness of your controls can be measured. So this is where, in a lot of cases, your technical people are have come in. We're down at the system level. I mean, there's some um, processes that have to be written, some guidelines that have to be written, but we're in the weeds now, and people are actually implementing the solutions. Um, Another output is the dependencies of each selected risk response measure on other risk response measures, because things interact and interconnect and actually impact each other, and sometimes things clash. Dependencies of selected risk response measured on I'm sorry, dependencies of selected risk response measures on other factors, for example, the implementation of other planned IT measures. Maybe you're in the middle of doing a rollout of Office 365. You're already in the middle of doing that, and you're also looking at security. The timeline for implementation of risk response measures comes out of risk response, outputs for monitoring the effectiveness of risk response measures, identification of risk monitoring triggers, and interim risk response measures selected for implementation if appropriate. There are also ongoing communications and sharing of risk related information with individuals or the organizational units impacted by the risk responses, including potential actions that may need to be taken by individuals or organizational units. In addition to the risk monitoring step, outputs from the risk response step can be useful inputs to the risk framing and the risk assessment step. So as you can see, the risk management process is not linear. It is iterative, and as you find out something at one step in the process, it feeds the other three steps. Here's an example. It is possible that the analysis occurring during the evaluation of alternatives course of action may call into question some aspects of the risk response strategy that is part of the risk management strategy generated during the risk framing step. Let me say that again. It is possible that the analysis occurring during the evaluation of alternative courses of action may call into question some aspects of the risk response strategy that is part of the risk management strategy generated during the risk framing step. In such instances, organizations use that information to inform the risk framing step with appropriate actions taken to revisit the risk management strategy and its associated risk response strategy. So as we know more, as we get into the weeds, as we learn more about the controls, we may discover something that needs to go back to the risk framing step, and that needs to go back to an earlier step to say, let's revisit that and let's adjust our strategy accordingly. Example two, organizations might also determine during the evaluation of alternative courses of action that some aspects of the risk assessments are incomplete or incorrect. This information can be used to inform the risk assessment step, possibly resulting in further analysis or reassessments of risk. And so that's the end of step three, the risk response, as covered in NIST Special Publication 839. Next up, we'll cover the last step of the risk management process, and that is the risk monitoring step. And so thank you for your time, and I hope you'll take a look at the other videos that are in this series. Have a great day.